Good morning. We still have a good number of our folks out in other places visiting with relatives, but we do have some visitors with us today, and we have a good number of our folks back with us, more than I thought would be. And so I'm thankful that we have brothers and sisters in Christ with whom to get together and consider the things of God and bring our worship and praise to His throne. Lord's days are precious. And Lord's days in the aftermath of a weekend of holiday and Thanksgiving, perhaps even more so. A week and a half ago, I had my mouth reconstructed on the inside, and I've been healing ever since. And so I'm going to try to spit out a lesson, but this is a sermon that is near and dear to my heart. One of the things I think that an older preacher can bring to the table in benefiting folks is long years of experience and reflection on thinking about certain things. And I can tell you that I spent several hours over the last couple of weeks on this, or I could tell you that I've spent the last 45 years on this sermon, and that would be more accurate, the latter representation. I've thought a long, long time about some of the things I'm about to present to you. And even though it may not seem like it, because I can't get too excited. In fact, the other day, Reagan cracked a joke to Caleb and me, and I couldn't couldn't laugh uh, because it hurt to laugh. But it may not seem like I'm overly excited about this, but I am extremely so. When you put interconnections together, little statements that are made in the biblical text, you think about them and reflect upon them, and come to a conclusion that reflects that long meditation on the Word. It's like something special comes together, and I hope that you're able to sense that a little bit today. Hebrews has long been a favorite of mine, and I'd like to reflect just a moment on what I think is a scriptural masterpiece. The Jewish question was the debated issue in the early church. And we may call it the Gentile issue, but it's really a Jewish issue. You need to make good Jews out of Gentiles in order for them to be faithful Christians. And what do you do with this whole Judaistic question? How do you interrelate the Old Testament and the New Testament, even for Jews? So the Acts of the Apostles begins in Jerusalem and it ends in Rome. Hebrews is written from Rome and it concerns events unfolding in Jerusalem. We come full circle. And I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and the 1960s were a turbulent period of history in this country. But the 60s in the first century AD were even more so a turbulent period for Christians, for the people of God. When you think about what happens in the 60s of the first century, it is like a decade that changes things fundamentally. Prior to the 60s, I think most of the apostles are still alive, and after the 60s, I think a good chunk of them are dead. There are major things that happen during that decade. Rome burns. in AD 64. And Emperor Nero is something of a madman, and people blame him for the fire of Rome, and he looks for a scapegoat, and he pins the blame on Christians. And a number of disciples of Christ are executed. And we learn from Roman history that he lights up his own gardens by burning Christians. Peter and Paul lose their lives in the aftermath of that persecution. Peter crucified upside down, Paul executed with the sword, which implies that his head is severed from his body. So prominent saints die for the faith during this period of time. You already have earlier in church history, James, the son of Zebedee, dying, Acts 12, by Herod. Prior to that, in Acts 7, Stephen, first Christian martyr. But in the 60s, around AD 62 perhaps, James, the Lord's brother, the author of the Epistle of James, is evidently cast headlong off of a pinnacle of a temple and or stoned to death and or both, according to various reports. Peter again is executed, crucified, in all likelihood upside down, according to the early traditions. Paul executed by having his head cut off. Can you even begin to imagine the trauma to the church, and even in the epicenter of the church, if you consider Jerusalem to be that, the beginning of all things, where it all started? James and Peter were two giant pillars of the Jerusalem church. Paul was not, but nevertheless had been arrested in Jerusalem. That eventually leads to his trial, and it eventually leads to his transport to Rome. So even Paul has Jerusalem connections, even from the time he was a youth under Gamaliel. And the trauma of losing these kinds of people, when we lose a preacher or an elder or someone near and dear who is an outstanding representative of the faith, we are somewhat traumatized by that. Do you think the Jerusalem church would not have been traumatized by losing people of this stature? And then the Jewish war breaks out, AD 66 to 70. You have smaller groups of zealots, smaller breakouts of revolt that don't gain a lot of traction. And then finally, in AD 66, these groups begin to unify, and they get enough traction so that the whole nation is in revolt. They kick the Roman armies out of Jerusalem and gain a military victory temporarily in AD 66. And Rome wants revenge. And so there's this huge bloody war that takes place from 66 to 70. It eventually ends up with Jerusalem being under siege, under attack, and eventually burned, the temple destroyed, just as Jesus said it would, as reported in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And essentially, not one stone is left upon another. You do have foundation stones of the temple on the western wall that still stand, but that's about it. And so this Jewish war changes everything for Palestinian Judaism, and particularly inhabitants of the capital city, Jerusalem. And so here we are around AD 66, 67 maybe, as this war is breaking out or about to do so. And the Hebrew writer, according to chapter 13, verse 22, presents a word of exhortation. Is it a sermon or is it an epistle? It lacks The customary introduction, typical of letter writing etiquette in that day and age, although it does have an epistolary ending, there were certain formal structural protocols. Letters followed this typical structure. And Hebrews completely lacks it. There's no name of an author, name of recipients, customary opening prayer and greeting. And instead, you have pulpit expressions that abound throughout the epistle. In chapter 3, verse 12, take care, brothers, lest there should be in any one of you an evil heart of unbelief and falling away from the living God. Chapter 4, verse 1, verse 11, etc. Therefore, let us. You see that hortatory subjunctive throughout the epistle. Chapter 5, verse 11. About this, we have much to say, and it is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. That's a preacher rebuking his audience. You become dull of hearing. Chapter 11, verse 32. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me if I mention all of these other characters. It's heroes of faith. Preachers are often running out of time. And Neil even ran out of time this morning in Bible class. But all seasoned preachers can relate to that last statement. Time would fail me if I mention all these others. So is this an epistle or is it a sermon? And I think the answer is yes. It's a bit of both. But you have an author familiar with his Jewish audience. And I say that because, as Abraham Lincoln has said way back when, he has a right to criticize who has a heart to help. A preacher can build up a certain amount of emotional currency by expressing goodwill with recipients so as to be able to reprove, rebuke, and exhort when the time comes to do that. But you can't be an effective preacher and just blast people. It doesn't work like that. They have to know, your recipients have to know that you have their best interests at heart. And if you look at some of the things that are said in Hebrews by way of rebuke, I believe he had to have known who he was dealing with here on a very personal, intimate basis, or he could not have gotten away with saying the things that he did the way that he says them. I wish that I could even tell you how many times people have taken me aside after I have had the best of intentions and raked me over the coals over something I've said or how I've said it. If I had a dollar for every time that occurred over the years, there's no way he could have said some of these things if he didn't know these people very, very well. And they knew that he had their best intentions at heart. And then we have the recipients of this epistle. And the ancient title given is to the Hebrews. It's not part of the text itself, it's part of the title attached to the documents, the manuscripts. But we can surmise, number one, that this is a Jewish group of Christians. That part is obvious. We can read between the lines and look at little clues here and there. Chapter 10, 32 and 33, for example, speaks of the former days in which they suffered intensely for their faith in Christ. Some in their number had been imprisoned, others had experienced the plundering of their property. And so here is a Jewish Christian community that had at one time experienced great adversity, and now they've got it a bit easier, and they're caught up in the hype of pro-Jewish sentiments. Cherished leaders are now dead. In chapter 13, verse 7, remember your leaders who spoke to you, past tense. The word of God, consider the outcome of their way of life, imitate their faith. In other words, here are some people who, in all likelihood, paid the ultimate price of martyrdom, and they set the ultimate example to the rest of you. You think about them during this critical juncture of time. What example that they set before you. Remember those leaders who formally spoke to you the word of God. And those leaders would evidently have included the apostles, because in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, the writer speaks of even those who had a connection, an eyewitness connection with Jesus, as having a connection with these recipients. Verses 3 and 4 of chapter 2, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us. I don't think he's just using an editorial us in a generic sense, but he's speaking genuinely of the connection that we had with the apostles and eyewitnesses who got this from the Lord himself. It was attested to us by those who heard, God also bearing witness by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. They had had a connection with the apostles in times past. That connection was no longer there to the same degree. There was an Italian connection somehow or some way, because the writer alludes to those from Italy. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 24, those who come from Italy send you greetings. And that has led commentators to speculate that this epistle was either written from Italy or to Italy. And it could go either way in terms of the grammar of the from Italy. It may well be that the writer is in Italy and he's sending greetings of those who are in Italy from Italy to Palestine. And I find it difficult that some of the pro-Jewish sentiment that is so near and dear to the temple, to a city of Jerusalem, and to the other factors that seem to be at play in Hebrews, I find it difficult to believe that the recipients are in Italy. I find it entirely plausible that the author can be in Italy, writing to Palestine, writing to Jews who are in and close to Jerusalem. He also alludes to the release of Timothy in verse 23 of Hebrews 13. And I don't believe Timothy had been released in Palestine. You'll remember in 2 Timothy 4 that Paul calls for Timothy. Paul is in Rome when he does that. Timothy goes to Rome, evidently, and evidently is arrested, and then evidently is released, which again makes better sense if all of this occurs in connection with the author being in Italy and the recipients being in Palestine. And finally, the Jewish temple is still very much on their minds. We can read that somewhat dispassionately and academically, even theologically, as if this is something merely hypothetical. But if the recipients were dwellers of Jerusalem or lived in or near Jerusalem, if they lived in Jerusalem, they were a few minutes' walk from the very temple that he describes, a temple that is about to be destroyed, and an old covenant that is about to be made obsolete, growing old and ready to vanish away, chapter 8 and verse 13. Their whole way of life is going to undergo a major transformation when Jerusalem falls. And that's a much more pressing issue to Jewish Christians in Jerusalem than it would be to Jewish Christians in Italy. There are a number of unsettling developments that are occurring. You have, over the years, the Jerusalem church had taken its lumps. After an explosive period of growth that we read about in the first 8 chapters of Acts, at the stoning of Stephen, a great persecution, an outbreak of persecution in connection with that stoning, is followed by the execution of the first apostle, James, the son of Zebedee. Jerusalem disciples are scattered. In connection with James' death, Peter is also nearly executed in Acts 12. Many talented disciples had already been scattered and were bringing the gospel to other regions, according to Acts 11. And after a reprieve, the apostles came together in Jerusalem with the elders, including James, the Lord's brother, to consider this Jewish Gentile question in Acts 15. And then a few years later, by the time Paul arrives in Jerusalem in the mid-50s of the first century, before his imprisonment, the apostles are evidently nowhere to be seen. You run into James and the elders, but no apostles are mentioned, at least in the text of Acts. James informs Paul of how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who had believed, and they are all zealous for the law. Chapter 21 and verse 20 of Acts. Where were the apostles? They were apparently preaching and teaching in other places already by the late 50s here, the mid to late 50s when Paul arrives. These Jewish disciples had not yet made a complete break with Judaism, and some would no doubt have been tempted to cast their lot with Moses if they were forced to choose between Moses the lawgiver and Jesus the Savior. Again, sometime around AD 62, James himself, along with other Christians, would be stoned to death and cast off the pinnacle of the temple. James, AD 62, Peter and Paul, AD 64, 65, are executed, martyred for the cause of Christ. And then the Jewish war breaks out in AD 66. Jewish nationalism explodes in Palestine. I want you to think about that. You have these little outbreaks of revolt, then combining and then gaining the upper hand in the center of gravity, and then the entire nation appoints a government in revolt against Rome, centered in Jerusalem. Do you understand the implications of that? To Christians, thousands of them who are living in Jerusalem as this is unfolding. Would disciples of Jesus side with their Jewish compatriots or with a more lasting spiritual allegiance to Jesus? When you see the abomination of desolation in the temple, get out. That's the prophecy of Jesus and the warning. Or as Luke tells it in Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem circled by armies, get out. I believe that's the background here. Written from Italy, this epistle of Hebrews to saints in Jerusalem and in the environs thereof. And you have all kinds of hints of the same in the epistle of Hebrews. We have a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty on high, not one in Jerusalem. Chapter 8 and verse 1. A minister of the holy places, the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Verse 2. These things serve as merely a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. Hebrews 8 and verse 5. Hebrews 8 and verse 13, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. It's ready to vanish away. This whole way of life is going down. And then you come to that great chapter, these hints. Celebrated temple is about to be destroyed. The capital city of Jerusalem is about to be demolished. And this great chapter of the heroes of faith in there are thousands of applications you can make of the heroes of the Old Testament. Thousands of applications. But when you read of the applications that he makes of the heroes of the Old Testament in chapter 11, it's very targeted and specific. By faith, verse 8, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place where he was to receive an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Could these recipients relate to that? By faith, he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Do you think they could relate to that statement? For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. Could they relate to that? Verses 13 through 16, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, not having seen them and greeted them from afar, but having seen them and greeting them from afar, having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles in the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Are you not reading between the lines here? It's time to get out. You're not going to have a permanent dwelling place, a permanent homeland, or a permanent city here upon the earth. You have a heavenly one. Now get out. In fact, I was going to do this in the sermon this morning, but I'm going to challenge you to go home and do this exercise. You reread every verse of Hebrews chapter 11, and you'll notice that virtually every application he makes of these Old Testament heroes has to do with displacement, a loss of familiar comfort zones, or civil noncompliance. Almost every application in the chapter has to do with that. Because when the hype and the hyper patriotism of revolt hits the air of first century Judaism, you cannot get caught up in that. Even if it means that you are so countercultural that you are viewed as essentially an enemy of the state because you're not getting caught up in the revolt against Rome. And then when he gives his final admonitions in chapter 13, when he says in verse 10 beginning, we have an altar from which those who serve at the tent have no right to eat, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. I believe he's winking at them and saying, get out. Now is the time. It's difficult for us to put our minds into what they were facing, having to leave their homeland, leave their city, leave their homes, leave everything they knew in near and dear to their hearts. But let me give you a 20th century parallel. Once in a while, Andrea and I watch World War II movies, and she makes the statement to me because she's a German citizen. And I just don't, she has trouble reconciling how Hitler could have ever come into power. And I sometimes run into this statement on the internet, and it evidently did not take place during the Nuremberg trials, but in a private conversation to a military officer or psychologist. But Hermann Goering said, "Why, of course, people don't want war. Why would some poor Slav on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy. And it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. No matter what you think of the Nazis, they understood crowd psychology. They knew how to manipulate the masses. And if you wanted to say in 1940s Germany, I'm going to be a conscientious objector, you might get out and get shot. They weren't going to accept that. Do you think it was any different in AD 66 in Jerusalem? But the parents of Moses were not afraid of the king's edict. Moses was not afraid of the king's anger. Rahab did not perish with those who were disobedient because she gave a friendly welcome to the spies. That was a capital offense in Jericho, by the way. Would have been. And neither should Jewish Christians go along with all the propaganda, patriotic fervor, or civil requirements in defense of Jerusalem against Rome. You can't be a part of this any longer. Get out. Now, do you appreciate Hebrews maybe just a little bit more? What's going on in between the lines here? Final word on authorship. Many guesses, Origen said, as to who really wrote the epistle. No one knows. There have been many guesses over the years. Was it Barnabas? Was it Luke? Was it some other prominent first century Christian? Did the Apostle Paul write it? When you look at all the boxes, he had to be a respected preacher who knew Palestinian Judaism well. He had to, in fact, I think he had to know and have some strong Jerusalem connections, or he couldn't have gotten away saying what he says. Someone who imbibed the spirit of Paul and who knew Timothy, someone who had Italian connections, someone who respected enough who could make very pointed applications to a Palestinian Jewish audience from Italy. And this is not a hill I'm going to die on. But I am 99% sure that Hebrews is written by Silas. And I say that because he was in Rome, cryptically called Babylon, when he wrote First Peter for Peter. He traveled with Paul and imbibed the spirit of Paul. He knew Timothy. He would have been in Rome during this period when Timothy was released, and he comes from Jerusalem. We could argue about Barnabas, about John Mark, about several other possibilities, but none of them check off all the boxes in my mind that Silas checks off. We could have a long conversation about that, and I'm not going to die on that hill. But I believe that he did write the epistle to Hebrews. So, the central argument is the way of Christ is better. You got a better messenger, a better lawgiver, a better high priest, a better covenant, a better sacrifice, a better promise, a better temple, a better city, a better homeland, a better everything. Do not cast your lot with a way of life and a system that is going down. What you got in Christ Jesus is infinitely better. And if you understand that, and if you believe it with every fiber of your being, then you can leave this behind. No matter the uncertainty, you can do it. Because you've come to a city whose builder and the one who laid the foundation stones is God. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Chapter 12, 28 and 29. Even when you have to leave your home and your way of life and everything near and dear to you, you have something to be thankful for. Because if you have Jesus in the new covenant and you lose everything else, you are rich. That's still true. Still true. It's a great epistle. Great, great epistle. There's still lessons here for us. You're subject to the invitation call of Christ. We're going to sing a song of encouragement to one another. Follow this word of encouragement with a song of encouragement. Let's stand and do that right at this time.